So imagine taking the most universally taboo, hidden, heavily stigmatized act in human behavior,
Right.
and then, giving it the ultimate responsibility, like literally holding the moral fabric of society together.
It's a massive leap.
It really is. So welcome to the deep dive. Today we are analyzing a source text that takes a subject that is usually, well, whispered about in deep shame and completely reverse engineers it.
Yeah, completely flips the script.
Exactly. We're looking at a highly specific, historically fascinating document that explores a sexia seli. And for those of you listening, that's an Arabic term that translates culturally to the secret habit.
Which is, a very nuanced way of referring to masturbation.
Right. So our mission today is to really unpack how this author elevates this private, often penalized action into, well, a fundamental biological necessity.
Yes, and a profound tool for personal discipline, actually.
Right. And this is where it really scales up into this totally fascinating territory. The text frames it as a protective shield for the entire community.
The sheer audacity of the argument is, honestly, what makes this text such a compelling subject for us to analyze.
I mean, yeah, definitely.
Because we're looking at a framework that doesn't just ask for, tolerance of a taboo. It actively campaigns for its utility.
Yeah, it's not just saying, hey, let's stop punishing this. It's saying, we actually need this.
Precisely. So we're going to map out the architecture of this argument today. We'll be impartially tracking the logic, the cultural framing, and the psychological connections the author builds piece by piece.
And what immediately struck me when reading this is that the author, they don't build this argument by starting with high-minded philosophy.
Yeah, not at all.
They don't start with morality. They start, in the dirt, so to speak. They start with baseline human biology.
Yeah, the literal physical mechanics.
Right. The text asserts that the secret habit sits on the exact same physiological shelf as eating, drinking, and excretion.
And, that categorization right there is doing an immense amount of heavy lifting right out of the gate.
Oh, absolutely.
Think about how we traditionally view the hierarchy of human needs, right? Food, water, waste removal. Those are at the foundational bedrock of survival.
You literally die without them.
Exactly. So by taking sexual release, something historically tangled up in all these, webs of morality, guilt, and social control, and just dropping it into the fiercely neutral category of basic biological maintenance.
It's wild.
It is. The author is attempting to strip away thousands of years of accumulated cultural baggage in one move.
Because, nobody feels a deep sense of existential shame about needing a glass of water.
Right. Or needing to breathe.
Yeah. And nobody has a moral crisis about needing to use the restroom. So the author is essentially framing sexual energy not as a moral test that you have to pass, but as a biological check engine light.
That's a great analogy.
Is that basically it? It's treating the body with this radical pragmatism. The system creates a byproduct, pressure builds up, and the system just requires a release to return to a baseline state.
Yeah, the concept of homeostasis is critical here.
Okay, unpack that a bit for me.
So in biology, homeostasis is just the state of steady, internal, physical, and chemical conditions maintained by living systems.
Like keeping the balance.
Exactly. If you don't drink water, your body's salinity goes completely out of balance.
All right.
If you don't excrete waste, your blood literally becomes toxic.
Wow.
So the text is arguing that unreleased sexual tension creates a very similar, tangible toxicity in the human system.
And the text gets incredibly specific about what that toxicity looks like, too. It doesn't just say, oh, you'll feel frustrated.
No, it lists physical symptoms.
Yeah. The author claims that utilizing this biological release valve eliminates physical and psychological pain, drastically improves mood, and this is the one that got me, helps eliminate high blood pressure alongside the general stressors of life.
Yeah, the high blood pressure point is fascinating.
Right, because when I read that, it gave me pause. It felt almost too literal, I found myself wondering if this sort of hydraulic, mechanical view of human sexuality is oversimplifying things. Are we just plumbing in pressure gauges?
Well, you're hitting on the core friction of the text's biological argument there. It is a highly mechanistic view of the body.
Yeah.
But it's actually deeply rooted in how the nervous system processes stress.
Okay, wait, really?
Yeah, let's unpack the high blood pressure claim.
Yes.
Because it operates on both a literal and a systemic level.
I'm tracking.
So when the body carries unreleased physiological tension, especially tension tied to a primal drive like reproduction.
Because that's hardwired into us.
Exactly. It doesn't just sit in the background. The body registers that unmet need as a state of lack, and that triggers a low-grade fight-or-flight response.
Oh, wow. So the sympathetic nervous system kicks in, the body thinks there's a problem to solve, so it floods the engine with cortisol and adrenaline.
Precisely that mechanism. And what do cortisol and adrenaline do?
They stress you out.
Right, but physically, they constrict blood vessels, they increase the heart rate, they literally measurably raise your blood pressure.
That makes total sense when you lay it out like that.
Yeah, you become irritable, your pain tolerance drops, and your psychological bandwidth just narrows. The text is observing these somatic symptoms of stress and offering a direct, highly accessible physiological antidote.
Because the physical act of release triggers the parasympathetic nervous system, right? Like it forces the body to hit the brakes. You get
Yeah.
a flood of endorphins, dopamine, and prolactin, which chemically wash away the cortisol.
And so the author is looking at that biochemical reality and asking a very pragmatic question.
Which is,
Why would you force your body to endure the agonizing friction of a chronic fight-or-flight state when the pressure release valve is already built into the system?
wow.
By criminalizing the relief of that pressure, whether that's socially or internally through guilt, the author suggests we are essentially mandating a form of biological self-harm.
That is such a heavy reframing. Okay, so I want to look at how that internal biological state translates to the outside world.
The social application.
Yeah, because if we accept this premise that the secret habit is basically just a physiological reset button, how does hitting that button change the way a person walks out their front door?
Right.
And this brings us to a part of the text that honestly gave me a moment of genuine cognitive dissonance.
I think I know what you're going to say.
Yeah, so the author argues that engaging in this practice actively creates sexual discipline. It claims it helps a person manage their sex life and lower their gaze.
Ah, yes. The paradox of disciplined release.
Right, because it runs counter to almost every single prevailing narrative we had about self-control.
It really does.
In most cultural frameworks, discipline is synonymous with denial. Engaging in a physical urge is viewed as a total loss of discipline.
A failure.
Yeah, a failure. We treat self-control like a muscle that you can only build by resisting the weight. So how in the world does giving in to the urge magically forge a disciplined person?
So to understand the author's logic here, we have to look at the psychological mechanics of restriction.
Mm.
Let's take the classic starvation diet as an analogy.
Okay, I love a food analogy.
Right. So if you decide that true dietary discipline means cutting out carbohydrates completely, absolute uncompromising restriction, what happens to your mental state after, say, a week?
Oh, your entire cognitive landscape is just taken over by bread.
Exactly.
Like you start noticing bakeries you never even saw before. You can smell toast from 3 blocks away. It completely hijacks your attention.
And that hyperfixation is the exact opposite of discipline. It is a state of mental chaos driven by biological panic.
Oh, that's a great phrase. Biological panic.
Yeah, and the text applies this exact same psychological principle to sexual energy. It argues that absolute white-knuckled repression doesn't create a disciplined mind.
It creates an obsessed mind.
Right. It creates a mind completely obsessed with the unmet urge. Your mental bandwidth is just consumed by the sheer effort of restriction.
So by proactively managing the need, by utilizing the secret habit as a controlled release, the individual takes the power away from the biological panic.
Yes.
They reclaim their mental bandwidth.
And that reclaimed bandwidth is precisely what allows for the concept of lowering the gaze, which the text highlights specifically.
I definitely want to dive deep into that because lowering the gaze is a very specific phrase. It implies an entire framework of how you interact with the public sphere.
It does. It's a profound cultural and religious concept that goes far beyond just, physically looking away from someone.
Right. It's not just staring at the sidewalk.
No, it represents visual modesty. Lowering the gaze means navigating the world without visually preying on the people around you.
Okay.
It means not leering, not letting your eyes linger with lust, and crucially, not reducing the human beings in your environment to objects of sexual gratification.
Which requires a tremendous amount of presence and, respect for the autonomy of others.
Absolutely.
But the text is arguing that trying to lower your gaze while your biological check engine light has been flashing red for 6 months is basically a losing battle.
It's near impossible.
Yeah. You are asking your conscious mind to fight a massive underlying hormonal tide.
And biology usually wins that war of attrition. The author recognizes that if you step out into the public square while starving, everyone looks like a meal.
Wow. Yeah.
So the discipline isn't found in trying to force yourself not to look while you're actively starving. The true discipline is found in ensuring you aren't starving when you walk out the door in the first place.
That reframing is incredibly potent.
It changes the whole definition.
Right, because the discipline isn't about the absolute avoidance of the act itself. The discipline is about segregating the act.
Yes, compartmentalizing it.
You choose to release that energy in private, in a controlled, solitary environment, specifically so that you can show up in public as a respectful, clear-headed human being.
The private indulgence is what funds the public restraint.
That's fascinating. The private indulgence funds the public restraint.
It creates a firewall between your biological needs and your social interaction.
Okay, I like that.
Yeah, when the battery is discharged privately, the individual is no longer interacting with the world through this distorted lens of pent-up aggression or desperate need. They can just engage with their colleagues, their neighbors, strangers, simply as people.
Okay, so if we follow this logic upward, if the individual is stabilized and their gaze is lowered so they aren't visually consuming the people around them, this personal control starts to scale.
It scales dramatically.
It really does. And the text takes this scaling to an absolute macro level. It moves from the privacy of a solitary bedroom to making massive, sweeping claims about the safety of society at large.
Right, we are entering the sociological core of the text now.
Yeah.
The author posits that this private habit acts as the ultimate shield against grave immoralities and atrocities.
And we definitely need to map out exactly what the text defines as atrocities here.
Important caveat, yes.
We want to acknowledge that these are the author's parameters of societal harm, not necessarily universal ones, but within the context of this text.
We're tracking their specific logic.
Right. So the text explicitly claims that this practice prevents harassment, adultery, which is often referred to in this context as zina,
Yes.
and what it translates as deviance, which in this framework encompasses homosexuality. Furthermore, it claims it prepares a person for marriage, promotes protective jealousy, and helps prevent incest.
These are arguably the heaviest, most destructive taboos within the author's cultural and religious framework.
It's staggering to think about the weight being placed on such a minor, hidden act.
It's a massive burden for one habit to carry.
Yeah, the text is taking masturbation and treating it like a sociological load-bearing wall.
That's a very accurate way to put it.
If we pull the lens back, the author seems to be suggesting a type of technical debt model for society.
Technical debt. Elaborate on that.
So in software engineering, if you don't do the minor, boring routine maintenance patches, the system seems totally fine for a while.
Okay, right.
But eventually, the underlying bugs multiply and multiply until the entire operating system just catastrophically crashes.
That scales perfectly to the text's sociological view. The author operates on a very specific, almost hydraulic view of human nature.
Meaning pressure-based.
Right. They believe that sexual energy is fundamentally kinetic. It's active. It cannot be permanently boxed up and stored away safely.
It's going to find a way out.
If it's denied a safe, solitary outlet, it doesn't just evaporate, it ferments. It mutates into something aggressive and destructive, seeking an outlet regardless of the moral cost.
So the operating system crash, in this metaphor, is the manifestation of these severe societal harms. Like, if the private pressure valve is blocked, the energy forcefully spills out into the public domain.
Exactly. The text argues that harassment is the direct result of unmanaged energy spilling over onto innocent strangers.
Right.
The individual loses the ability to contain their internal pressure, so they externalize it aggressively, and it's similar with adultery or zina.
How so?
Well, the author views adultery not just as a failure of moral character, but as a catastrophic failure of pressure management. The biological urge becomes so incredibly overwhelming that it overrides the cognitive commitments of loyalty. It breaks the covenant of marriage.
Because the biological panic takes the wheel.
Exactly. And the text goes even further into darker territory by mentioning the prevention of incest and deviance.
Yeah, that part was heavy. It suggests that absolute white-knuckled repression can actually warp an individual's psychological boundaries to a terrifying degree.
The premise here is that extreme repression breeds extreme transgression.
Wait, say that again?
Extreme repression breeds extreme transgression. When the most basic biological relief is completely denied, the mind becomes desperate.
Okay, I'm following.
In that state of deep, prolonged deprivation, the internal psychological barriers that prevent horrific taboos like incest begin to degrade.
The boundaries just fall apart.
They do. The author is arguing that providing a safe, solitary, non-harmful outlet anchors the mind. It prevents the psychological landscape from deteriorating into those dark, destructive territories out of sheer biological desperation.
So it's basically a harm reduction strategy on a societal level.
Very much so.
I want to spend some time on the claims regarding marriage and family dynamics too, because the text makes two very specific points here. First, it states that the secret habit prepares a person for marriage.
Which sounds completely counterintuitive.
Right. At first glance, sitting alone in your room seems like the absolute opposite of preparing for a lifelong partnership with another human being.
It seems isolating, yeah.
Yeah. But how does the text justify this?
Well, you have to filter it through the lens of stabilization we've been discussing. Why do people get married? Ideally, it's for companionship, shared values, building a life together, right?
In a healthy scenario, yes.
But if a person is operating from a place of intense, unmanaged sexual starvation, their entire motivation for marriage becomes completely distorted.
It's the grocery shopping while starving analogies all over again.
Exactly.
You aren't looking at the nutritional value or the long-term viability of the food. You are just grabbing the highest calorie item you can find as fast as possible because your body is screaming at you.
And building a lifelong marital commitment on the foundation of a biological panic is a recipe for disaster.
Because what happens when you finally eat?
Right. Once the initial starvation is satiated, the couple is left staring at each other, realizing they might have absolutely nothing else in common.
That's a really bleak but probably very accurate picture.
The text argues that by utilizing the secret habit, an individual can quiet the biological panic before they even start looking for a partner.
Okay.
They can approach the massive socioeconomic and emotional commitment of marriage with a clear, rational mind. They're choosing a partner based on genuine compatibility, rather than just using another human being as a frantic escape hatch for their own frustration.
That makes total sense within this framework. You stabilize the individual so they actually have the agency to make rational long-term choices. But the text also claims that this practice promotes modesty and inherits jealousy. And that's a term that points to a very specific cultural concept known as gira. Right.
Yes. Gira is a complex and deeply held value in many traditional societies.
Yeah.
It translates roughly to protective jealousy or a profound sense of honor regarding one's family.
Can you break that down a bit more? Like, what does that look like in practice?
Sure. It's essentially the drive to protect the sanctity, dignity, and physical safety of the household from external threats or corruption. It's a fiercely protective stance over your loved ones.
Okay, so how does a private, solitary habit foster that kind of outward-facing protective vigilance? It seems disconnected.
Well, the author draws a direct line between internal integrity and external protection.
Okay.
The logic dictates that a person whose own sexual desires are chaotic, unmanaged, and predatory cannot possibly serve as a righteous protector of their own home. If you are wandering the streets, unable to lower your gaze, mentally violating the boundaries of others, your own moral compass is fundamentally compromised.
You basically lose the moral authority to protect your own household because you have become the very threat you were supposed to be guarding against.
Exactly. You are the danger.
Wow.
But by engaging in a solitary release, the individual maintains their internal discipline. Because they aren't forced to act out inappropriately in the world, their sense of honor remains completely intact.
So they aren't carrying around this secret hypocrisy.
Right. They can maintain that fiercely protective, dignified stance over their family because they aren't harboring internal corruption. The private act secures the moral high ground required for public and familial duty.
This is wild. So, summarizing this massive macro argument, the text completely flips the script on selfishness.
It really does.
Because masturbation is almost always framed culturally as an inherently selfish, totally self-indulgent act, like you're just focused on yourself.
A vice, yeah.
But this text argues that it is deeply civic-minded. You are taking responsibility for your own biological maintenance so that you do not become a burden, a hazard, or a destructive force to your neighbor, your spouse, or your community.
It essentially transforms the act from a private vice into a public service.
But, and this is a massive bid, but here, with all this incredible weight placed on the act, the author doesn't just offer it up as a free-for-all.
No, absolutely not.
Because if we go back to the mechanical analogy, you don't just pour oil into an engine continuously until it overflows.
Right, that would flood the engine and break it.
Exactly. The author provides a very strict user manual.
And that manual is vital.
Yeah.
Because it proves the author clearly understands the difference between a medicine and a poison.
Right.
The text establishes rigid guardrails to ensure the practice remains a tool for stabilization, rather than just mutating into a new form of chaos.
Let's break down the practical rule the text outlines. It states explicitly that this must be practiced only according to need, and it lays down a hard boundary that it should not exceed once a day.
That phrase, according to need, is the operative engine of the entire practical philosophy here.
How so?
Well, the author is not advocating for hedonism. They're not suggesting that pleasure, for the sake of pleasure, is the goal.
The goal isn't just to feel good.
Right. The goal is homeostasis. You only engage the pressure release valve when the pressure gauge is actually in the red.
Which means you have to be deeply honest with yourself about what constitutes an actual biological need.
Yes.
There's a massive difference between eating because your stomach is growling and you're lightheaded
Yeah.
and, binge eating a pint of ice cream because you had a really stressful day at work.
That distinction is exactly what the author is trying to enforce.
Okay.
If an individual begins to use the secret habit simply out of boredom,
Or as an emotional crutch.
right, if they use it to avoid dealing with anxiety, sadness, or non-sexual stress, the act loses its medicinal value entirely.
It stops being a reset button.
It ceases to be a biological release valve and just becomes an escapist addiction. It becomes a new master.
That dosage limit is fascinating to me, too. Not exceeding once a day, it almost acts as a built-in diagnostic tool.
In what way?
Well, if you find yourself compelled to exceed the dosage, the text is essentially telling you that your biology is no longer being managed. Your biology is managing you.
That's a great way to put it.
The cure has become the disease.
Every medicine has a therapeutic window, right? Below a certain dose, it's totally ineffective. Above a certain dose, it's toxic. The author is calibrating the exact therapeutic window for human sexual tension.
Which leads us to the final and perhaps the most intellectually daring layer of the entire document.
The theological defense.
The theological defense. Because mapping out the biology and the sociology is one thing. That's earthly stuff. But aligning it with a strict religious framework requires a completely different kind of heavy lifting.
It requires navigating a landscape where the stakes are not just earthly harmony, but divine law and ultimately spiritual standing.
And the text makes its theological case by relying on what isn't there.
Silent.
Right. It asserts that there is no explicit text from the Holy Prophet forbidding the secret habit. And then it draws this really sharp contrast, noting that the Quran does explicitly and severely condemn zina, adultery, and fornication.
This is actually a masterclass in a specific branch of ancient jurisprudence.
See, I have to push back on this a little bit.
Okay, go ahead.
Because to a modern reader, for you and me, this can sound suspiciously like looking for a loophole.
Yeah.
The author is basically saying, look, the Quran uses its heaviest, most terrifying language to draw a massive red line around adultery. But the prophet never directly, by name, banned this specific solitary act.
Right.
Is the entire religious justification really resting on a technicality of omission?
Well, calling it a loophole imposes a very modern, somewhat cynical view of the law onto what is actually a very ancient, highly structured philosophy of divine legislation.
Okay, correct me then. How should we look at it?
To understand the author's theological defense, we have to explore a foundational legal maxim in many schools of Islamic jurisprudence. It's called alas fil asha alibaha.
Okay, which translates to what exactly?
It translates roughly to the fundamental principle concerning things is that they are permissible.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. In this legal framework, the default state of human action is freedom. You do not need a divine text to give you permission to eat an apple or walk down the street or engage in a new behavior.
So you start at yes.
Exactly. The burden of proof falls entirely on prohibition.
So unless the ultimate authorities, the Quran and the verified sayings of the Prophet, step in and explicitly plant a red flag saying, do not do this, the action remains in this massive open pasture of the permissible.
Yes. And within theology, the silence of the lawgiver is never considered an accident.
That's not a typo.
No, it is never an oversight. If the divine is perfect, then the law is perfect.
Right.
Therefore, if the divine chose to explicitly forbid adultery, harassment, and deviance, but chose to remain utterly silent on the solitary act of masturbation, that silence is a deliberate design feature of the law.
Wow. So the silence is the permission.
Yes. The theological logic is incredibly profound when you step back and look at it. The divine lawgiver created the human biological machine, right?
Right.
The lawgiver knows that this machine generates immense, relentless pressure.
It's a feature, not a bug.
Exactly. So by heavily barricading all the destructive outward-facing avenues of release, banning the actions that destroy families, blur lineages, and harm others.
But leaving the solitary self-contained avenue unaddressed?
Yes. By doing that, the law implicitly builds the pressure release valve right into the theological structure.
It's an incredibly pragmatic view of divinity.
It really is.
It suggests a legal framework that is focused on tangible harm reduction rather than, impossible angelic purity.
Because humans aren't angels.
Right. If the ultimate goal of the religious law is to protect society from the catastrophic atrocities we discussed earlier, then a solitary act that safely vents the pressure and prevents those atrocities isn't a sin.
Wrong.
It is a protective measure that is perfectly aligned with the overarching goals of the divine law.
It brings the entire massive argument full circle.
It really does.
The biological reality necessitates a release. The psychological management of that release creates personal discipline.
Right.
That personal discipline scales up to protect the social fabric of the community. And the theological framework of intentional silence provides the spiritual permission for the entire system to operate.
Provided, of course, the individual stays within the strict parameters of the dosage.
Yes, that is the linchpin.
It is a stunningly tight, interlocking architecture of an argument. When you pull back and look at the sheer scale of what the author has constructed from such a brief text, it's just remarkable.
We've basically watched the author take a deeply ingrained, almost universally held cultural taboo and completely dismantle it down to the studs.
Yeah. They took the secret habit, an act shrouded in the darkest corners of guilt and shame, and dragged it into the clinical light of biological maintenance, placing it right next to drinking water.
They reframed it as a vital psychological stabilizer, one that actively lowers blood pressure, clears the mental bandwidth, and cures the irritability of a stressed nervous system.
They argued that instead of destroying self-control, this private indulgence is the very engine that funds our public discipline.
Yes.
It allows a person to navigate the world with a lowered gaze, treating others with profound respect rather than predatory hunger.
And they position this hidden act as the ultimate defender of societal morality, protecting the sanctity of marriages, securing the protective honor of the household, and preventing horrific transgressions by safely venting the dangerous, mutating buildup of repressed energy.
And finally, they anchored all of this in a really bold theological defense, one built on the profound, deliberate silence of the law, while packaging the entire philosophy within a strict, non-hedonistic dosage of once a day according to genuine need.
It forces the reader to completely reevaluate the mechanics of morality.
It absolutely does. And that leads me to a final thought for you, our listener, to mull over as we wrap up today.
Where are we going with this?
Well, we spent this entire deep dive mapping out how this highly specific text treats one heavily stigmatized physical act. But what happens if we extrapolate this text's underlying logic and apply it to the broader landscape of human emotion?
Oh, the broader landscape of our internal drives.
Exactly. Think about our other deep private urges. Think about our urge for profound anger, our capacity for messy, inconvenient grief, or even our deep-seated need for radical, isolating independence.
Things we usually try to hide.
Right. We spend so much societal energy treating these intense drives as shameful secrets. We are told to repress them, to hide them away in the dark, to pretend they just don't exist so we can present this clean, unbothered facade to the world.
It's a perfect dashboard.
A perfect dashboard, exactly. But if we viewed these turbulent emotions through the author's lens...
As pressure valves.
Yes. If we saw them as necessary biological and psychological pressure valves that, when managed safely and privately, actually prevent us from inflicting chaos on our communities, how would that completely rewrite our modern definitions of guilt?
It would completely upend how we define self-control.
It really would.
Yeah.
Because we often think of morality as maintaining that spotless, perfectly clean dashboard where no warning lights ever come on.
But that's an illusion.
It's a total illusion. Maybe true morality isn't about the absence of messy internal pressure. Maybe true morality is simply having the self-awareness to read the blurred, flashing warning lights of our own biology.
And acting on them responsibly.
And having the discipline to pull over, pop the hood, and relieve the pressure in the dark before the whole engine tears itself and the people around us completely apart.
It challenges us to stop fighting our humanity and start actually managing it.
Keep that in mind next time you feel the pressure building. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.